Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to get this webinar started. I wanted to make just a quick couple of announcements and also introduce our presenters today. First of all, if you look in the question and answer area, you can see that there's just a few little announcements there with some links to additional resources that you may find helpful. So feel free to explore those, and please feel free to use the Q&A box to submit any questions that you might have, and our presenters will either answer through the chat box or they may save it and respond to you at the end of their presentation. So I'll go ahead and introduce our presenters now. Our presenters are Joe Spillner and Colton Kreth. Joe is a senior manager in Squire's tax department. He's originally from California, Silicon Valley. So Joe has found himself right at home with Utah's rapidly growing Silicon Slopes. Joe specializes in the technology industry, where he provides consulting and compliance services to a variety of clients consisting of both private and public corporations. Colton is an advisory professional at Squire who focuses on outsourced accounting services with privately held and publicly traded companies. Colton is also part of our ERP implementation team and specializes in implementing Microsoft Dynamics 365 Business Central. When Colton isn't working, he enjoys spending time with family in the mountains, hiking, fishing, camping, and backpacking. One of Colton's other hobbies is golfing, and he enjoys a quick 9-hole round before work with family, friends, clients, and others. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to them.
Great, thanks Sarah for that awesome introduction. So as Sarah mentioned, my name is Joe Spillner and I'm joined by my colleague Colton today, and we're going to discuss cash flow scenario planning. And this is obviously very prevalent in today's environment with COVID-19 and the pandemic, but I did want to preface this webinar with a quick disclaimer that while we're going to use the COVID-19 pandemic as, in most of our examples, considering it's at the top of everyone's mind right now and kind of the overall priority, I did want to mention that scenario planning is still vital and it should be performed by companies on an ongoing basis, even in a non-pandemic world. None of us have a crystal ball to look into the future, and scenario planning, as we're going to discuss, is a tool to help us mitigate the risk associated with the uncertainty of not knowing future events. So just wanted to mention that ahead of time, so that way everyone understands that this is something that should be undergone from all management teams, again, regardless of the pandemic or not. So our agenda today is I'm going to discuss scenario planning, kind of the basics of it first, and then Colton is going to go into an example of the cash flow scenario tool that we've built here at Squire. And then we could follow up some Q&A if there are any, and then wrap up the presentation thereafter. So let's go ahead and get started with scenario planning. We're going to discuss what is it, why is it important, and then kind of the steps of scenario planning as well as the methodology behind it. So what is scenario planning? And the long-winded answer that I came up with here is a management tool designed to assist organizations with decision-making by means of a formalized method for analyzing alternative scenarios based on internal and external influences. So what does that all mean? Really, it's a tool that management can use that models out multiple cause and effect relationships for scenarios that may or may not come to fruition in the future to help us plan. And so that leads right into the next question, which is, why is scenario planning important? And again, it's a means for companies to visualize the future and understand what those cause and effect relationships are with potential drivers and external forces that they may have on the company. And overall, as I mentioned earlier, it provides a greater insight for management to make decisions. We want to be able to utilize this tool to understand how future events may impact our business, so that way we are ready for them, as ready as you can be. I think there's always going to be the greatest benefit is planning for the future, regardless of whether or not that may come to fruition. So if it does, we we aren't caught off guard by future events, and we're well organized and plan for it, and understand the decisions that we need to make as a company. And it gives us a leg up on our competitors, being able to react to these future events with greater certainty and greater confidence and speed, and gives us a leg up there. So what are the steps now to develop a scenario plan, and what's the methodology behind it? And this is the methodology that Squire's adopted, and it mirrors other scenario planning methodology out there, as some who may be familiar with scenario planning would notice here. But at the same time, we adopted this methodology because we believe it's more concise and clear, and it's only a 6-step process, where you may see other scenario planning steps have many more items to it. But the overall intent of scenario plan is not to overwhelm management team. Instead, it's just to provide them with a tool fairly high level, so that way they have the information readily available at hand to make decisions on the fly, and be able to adapt quickly here. So again, we thought that this plan that we've adopted here is kind of the most concise and intuitive for us. And we're going to dive into each of these steps a little bit quicker, but just as an overall, these are the steps to take in order to develop a scenario plan. First, you have define the scope and identify key variables to be evaluated. Second, you identify the influential drivers in the cause and effect relationships. Next, you collect and analyze data. Following that, you develop the scenario, which is where Colton's going to go over the example that we've developed on our end using our tool at Squire. And then we apply the scenarios and action plans. And lastly, you maintain and update the scenario models in order to make sure that is relevant and continue to use it on a frequent basis. And so again, now let's dive into each of these in a little bit more detail. So step 1, define the scope and identify the key variables. Overall here, we're looking at what is the issue and the task at hand. What are the questions that we're trying to answer? And with regards to that too, we need to keep in mind, what's the time frame that we want to look at? As we look at COVID-19 as an example in particular, it's the first case in the U.S. I believe was back in January, and I think a lot of the public, and including government officials, had expected now by coming up on the end of July that we would have had a good handle of everything going on there. But we're continuing to see spikes throughout the country, and as such, I think it shows the importance of understanding a good time frame. If we were to look back in January and model out a couple months only, it wouldn't be as great of a tool and provide us the information that we need, as opposed to now we're seeing that, it's we're 7 months in, and there's still going to be a time period ahead of us that we're going to be living in this pandemic world for who knows how long. And so I think it's important here to understand the scope and the time frame that we want to analyze here. And then the last part here is, what are the key variables that the company is focused on analyzing? What are we looking at, these cause and effect relationships, these drivers that are going to affect our business? What do we want to look at within our business as metrics to analyze, to help management team make the appropriate decisions that they need to do in response to these drivers? Step 2 is going to be identify those key drivers and those cause and effect relationships. So what are the external and internal forces that are going to drive the results of the scenarios? Are we looking, again, COVID-19 as the example? Are we looking at political intervention, being the driving force? Are we looking at consumer trends, an internal culture of having a payroll, or our employees work on a remote basis now? Those are all external and internal forces that can drive the scenario. And then we need to identify and analyze the cause and effect relationships that those forces have on our business, and how it's going to affect the various variables that we previously identified, you know, is it going to affect our sales growth figures? Is it going to, you know, have an effect on our operating expenses or whatever it may be? We need to understand that cause and effect relationship in order to appropriately build out the scenario modeling so it does give us the data that we need. Step 3 is collect and analyze the data. You know, I think this is pretty self-explanatory, but there's a couple points in here to keep in mind. You know, we do want to gather both quantitative and qualitative data. You know, not, again, consumer trends, the culture internally and externally of the company. Those are all qualitative pieces that need to be considered and are going to have material effect on the projections and the overall impact of our business. You know, the historical data, as we met here, and future projections should both be taken into consideration. Historical data is really going to lay the groundwork for the scenario planning. You know, it's going to be the base that we are then going to modify and adapt to the drivers that we see in the cause and effect relationships that we see in order to build out the scenario modeling. And of course, the last point there again is analyze the data in accordance to various timeframes. Don't limit yourself to just one time frame there. And so step 4, you know, is steps 1 through 3 was kind of the meat of gathering the data and understanding what you need to do in your scenario model here. And step 4 is actually developing it. And we want to quickly highlight a few of the best practices here. And the first, I think, is one that's very key, and it's develop only 2 to 4 scenarios in your scenario planning model. And the reason that it's 2 to 4 is, again, this is supposed to be something that, you know, accuracy is great, but it's supposed to just help drive decision-making process. And it's not supposed to overwhelm our management team. You could build a million different scenarios and try and get down to the penny, but it's really not going to be as beneficial as getting something that helps the management team understand the cause and effect relationships with the key drivers and key variables of the business in order to help us make decisions. We want this to be a tool that helps us move quickly and confidently, as opposed to something that overwhelms us, takes a very long time, and maybe get to, you know, be off by a couple dollars, but again, takes us too long to actually make a decision off of. Next, we should be consistent and be well documented. The scenarios are going to have multiple assumptions to them. They're, you know, we want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples. And so make sure that we're consistent, and then with those assumptions, make sure that we're documented so that way, you know, we understand where our decisions are coming from and not getting lost in the details here. And again, as I mentioned earlier, accuracy is important, but the goal here is just to provide data that's going to help our management team make future decision making and actionable plans. Step 5 is to apply the scenarios and action plans. Ultimately, you know, we see in our industry that companies will go through the exercise of developing a scenario planning and put together all the data, but they just let it go to waste as they don't put together actionable plans or have, you know, plan A, B, and C ready. So when the future uncertain events maybe do come to fruition, we know what decisions need to be done. We already have a plan in place and action items to follow. So again, the biggest thing is don't let your hard work go to waste. Make sure that you have plans ready and action items ready to take appropriate action on. And then lastly is just maintain and updates. You know, as time doesn't stand still, and neither should your scenario planning. You know, as things continually change in the future and within your business, we want to make sure that we continue to use scenario planning to make sure we're always prepared for the unexpected. So make sure that you maintain an update as things change, and we see that change happening with COVID-19 on a constant basis. You know, with different health reform and government intervention, we want to make sure that our scenario planning is not outdated by the time that you know, these events may come to fruition again. So that being said, now I'm going to turn the time over to Colton, and Colton's going to run through our tool that we built here at Squire, and in particular related to the cash flow scenario planning as opposed to just general scenario planning in general. So Colton, you want to go ahead and take over? And oh, Colton, I think you're muted.
Yeah. Let me just share my screen really quick. Oh, wrong one. Let me get the right screen on here. All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yep, perfect.
Cool. All right, so to kind of jump in with what Joe said, we live in a world of uncertainty, and whether it is related to COVID or other things, you know, part of the reason why I put some of my hobbies in there is because I feel like they can teach us a lot of valuable things, and we can use those things within business. So a good example of using scenario planning is within golfing. And I don't know how many people on this call have ever tried to go golfing, but you'd think it'd be easy, but it's really not. And when you just first start out, some of the things that you have to do to keep the ball in play are kind of a little bit different. And you know that there's different drivers that affect kind of the variables of how you play the ball. So let's say, for example, like when I started out golfing, I always hit the ball way to the right and had a massive slice, you know, typical baseball player. And that driver was just me. It was the way that I hit the ball. Now the variable is that I could change the way that I lined up at the ball, so change the direction, so that I could keep the ball in play. So if I lined up where I would hit it down the middle of the fairway, if you know I had everything figured out, that ball would be to the right out of bounds. So if I aimed a little further left, then that would come back into play and I'd be able to play my second shot. So scenarios, right, are looking at the situation that we have right now in front of us, looking at them and saying, okay, what are the results that are more than likely going to happen, given that I do the same thing that's been done in the past, or let's say that I improve my golf swing in this situation, or if I get better at X, Y, or Z, what's going to happen? And at the very beginning of this, we needed to define kind of the scope and what we want to measure to make this happen. So this scenario model right here is what we've built out. For this particular one, there are 4 items that we want to be able to look at and determine what each scenario is going to do. So as you can see, the first one is cash and cash equivalents. So we need to say, okay, if this happens, then this is what's going to happen with our cash balance over time. If this happens, it's going to do this, or if this happens, it's going to do that. So as you can see from this report right here, there are 3 different lines, scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3, that show what's going to happen to our cash balance. In a few of these, the cash balance actually goes negative. So you could say, okay, now that I know my cash balance is going to go negative, I need to do what I can to be able to get this back positive. So that's where you look into either getting more debt to help you through the current situation, looking into SBA loans, you know, seeing if you could do anything with getting another owner or investor, and just digging into those specific options depending on your circumstance. From there, you could go and click through and say, okay, I want to see how this is going to affect net income. I want to track what my sales are going to do across the period based off of these scenarios. And then you could create a bunch of different ones of these, just depending on what you wanted your dashboard to look like. And that's going to be part of the scoping, is to see what you would actually like kicked out of this at the very end. From here, when we understand exactly what you're looking for and what we want, we will go and import your historical financial statements by month, as well as the amount at the end of last year. So for this one, we've tried to kind of make this pretend company match a little bit of kind of a dental industry when it comes to kind of the trend lines and how things have worked. And it's obviously just us playing around, so it's not real numbers, but this should be able to help us kind of see what this tool is doing. So we put this historical information in, and then from there we have our our input tab. And what we've done is we've taken the historical results and we've said, okay, what happened over the last 6 months for this company? So it looked like the company had kind of a growth rate of 2% up to kind of COVID. And then when COVID happened, they were able to work for most of March, but then they got shut down in April, and they were able to pick up a little bit towards the end of the May, and then in June, their sales spiked as they started to kind of get back to normal levels and then catch up on people who weren't able to be seen during these kind of COVID months when things were down. From there, we also can say, okay, well, we got most of our clients back in June, but we still have a pretty good increase in July, and then things are going to kind of level off, and we'll kind of write kind of a narrative of a story of what's going to happen within the business, right? So with scenario 1, the story really comes down to, okay, COVID made us shut down for April, May, or for March, April, and most of May, right? Things pick back up in June and July, where we're going to be crazy busy catching up with other patients. But now we're seeing kind of a spike in cases. And because of this spike in cases, we still have people coming in. So we're still kind of growing, but our growth isn't going to be what it was in the future. We're just going to have these few months where we catch up a little bit more, and then our growth is going to be more about 1%, right? From there, we can also look at our margins and say, okay, are we going to decrease our margins, or what are our margins going to do? Our COGS, are they going to be relatively the same, or are they going to be lower, and how is that going to affect everything? So these ratios that we have are kind of the key variables that we see that kind of drive the business and help us kick out our different financial statements for us to review going forward. So this section can help us look at the historical results and say, hey, look, this is what happened. It looks like people stopped paying their bills in April and May, right? Do we expect that going forward? And then what's the story? Are people going to be paying the bills? Is insurance behind schedule with paying the bills in this situation, or what is going to happen there? Or maybe they're shut down, so they're not able to actually work, and that's part of the reason why our days in AR outstanding are higher, right? So we can create this narrative. From there, we can see the history, and then we can also create the story going forward. And then the hard part is quantifying that story for the future. And that's what this spreadsheet is designed to do, is to quantify it, but it quantifies it in 3 different scenarios. So scenario 1, we plug the data based off of this story. So this story says this and this and this is what's gonna happen. And then we say, okay, how does that affect what our financial statements? How is that going to affect our sales growth? And for each company, for each industry, it's going to be completely different. And you can do that kind of by month and just make up these 3 or 4 stories and do it that way. So from there, we can also see with this company, they got a $100,000 PPP loan, and we can come and say, okay, that PPP loan is right there. And we can go forward and say, okay, where is this PPP loan going to be forgiven at? And we can estimate kind of a forgiveness. And, you know, in this one, we estimated kind of around the 31st of March next year, just as an estimate for when they get money back. So you can do that with multiple scenarios. And then what happens is this flows into a financial statement, right? And within this financial statement, you can see your balance sheet. You can come here and look at the data, look at the hard numbers and say, okay, what's happening to cash here, AR, so on and so forth. More of an accountant type of view, financial, a little bit more down in the details with these scenarios that are getting kicked out. But then this will flow back into our dashboard where we can say, okay, scenario 1 does this, scenario 2 does this, scenario 3 does this. And then we'll also plug in your actual information so that you can see how your actual information is trending compared to your scenarios. And then you can adjust your scenarios going forward to make it so that this is really an applicable tool and easy to use. And yeah, the issue is we've looked into this is that most of the forecasting tools don't really have something that shows you scenarios side by side for the key variables that you want to see. And so this spreadsheet does a great job of that. It's a very simple design, very simple spreadsheet really to use once you understand kind of these variables and how it works, but it can be very powerful to be able to see things side by side. And with these scenario models, they do really help us understand what could happen with our business. And from there, we can make decisions to be able to help us out. So for example, if we were in a different industry looking at this and we were seeing that our sales were going down, like let's say, for example, if we were a retail store and that retail store doesn't really have that much of an online presence, right? So they're just selling things mostly out of the store and they're looking at their trend line and it's going down and they're saying, hey, you know, we have other companies that are like us that are having incredible growth because, you know, no one can go on vacation, but yet here we are struggling because we don't have the online presence. So now we can say, okay, we need to boost sales. The biggest way to do that is by moving online. Let's grab a marketing company and let's see if we can get you set up where you can do some search optimization, where you can get a website built, where you can do things like that. So that then going forward, you'll have everything that you need in place for kind of this new economy that COVID's creating. And yeah, there's a bunch of different variables that go into this. And as you create your story and your narrative, we can help you kind of see what your industry trends are. We can help you see what has been happening with other companies. And then also this can lead into some strategic planning decisions where we can say, okay, if we do this and this and this, that can help us in this way. And at the end of the day, that affects our cash dollar amount by this type of a thing, this projection line. So there's a lot of things that you can do here, and showing the scenario side by side can really help you determine what is driving the changes in your business. And when you understand that more and more, then you're able to actually pinpoint the things that are most important and focus on those. And then that can make you more efficient going forward and can help you be able to not just react to the current environment, but be a leader in it, because you really will have more information and a better understanding of how things are working and what causes your business to grow. So we highly recommend scenario planning, and you know, we obviously have this tool that we can work with you on to kind of go through and create your stories. As we would go through this process with the client, the biggest thing that we would do is help them up front to be able to write out their stories and their plan, because plugging numbers into the spreadsheet is one thing, but really developing a good plan and a good narrative that talks through, okay, what is happening in the business? Let's see if we can figure out what could happen, and really digging in to those specific things where it's like, okay, the economy could be shut down because of the spike in cases. We don't know if that's going to happen, but it could. So we can create a scenario that takes that into account. You know, it could be one of those things where we expect the cases not to spike necessarily right now, or the government to get shut down now, but we think that during kind of the winter months, as immune systems are suppressed and other things happen, where we could see another shutdown. And how is that affecting kind of our outputs, right? So if you're an accounting firm kind of like Squire, do we have the infrastructure in place for people to work remotely so that when that happens, we are good to go? And you can look at those variables. Do we have connections with banks so that when we need further financing, or if we need to extend our line of credit, can we get that? Can we make that happen? And there's a bunch of other things like that where, as you write out the story, and you write out 2 or 3 different stories for your thing, and then figure out, okay, how is this story going to affect these ratios? And at the end of the day, how is it going to affect, you know, my sales, my net income, my costs, you know, and then my cash. From there, you can determine a lot of the things that you really need to know going forward to make the best decisions and be in a position where you can move quickly and be able to really not only just react to the changes, but proactively be engaged and be ahead of the game when it comes to the uncertainty that's in front of us. So that's all that I had on this. Were there any questions that anybody had?
So far, we haven't had any questions come in, but we'll give everybody just a few more seconds here, just in case.
Perfect. Yeah, so just wanted to reemphasize for everyone, scenario planning is something that should be, you know, a process that's being undergone on a consistent basis, and especially important given the uncertainties surrounding COVID-19. You know, as we look to the future, it's very uncertain at this time, and the best way to be prepared for it is to have plans that are ready and actionable items that you can quickly put into effect in order to help mitigate the risk associated with that uncertain future. And you know, it's the future's a lot less scary if you're planned and well prepared for it. So that's where this model kicks in. But this is only step one. Again, the data analytics and everything of the model is great, but you do need that actionable item, you know, following up on this, because otherwise it's just going to go by the wayside. So we'll wait for just a little bit longer to see if we have any questions, and if there are any that come up afterwards, Sarah's going to send out our contact information along with the slide deck, and you can feel free to reach out to myself, Colton, or any professional at Squire, and we help you guys get set up with the scenario modeling for you guys.
All right, it doesn't look like we have any questions, so thank you guys all for attending, and Joe and Colton, thank you so much for the presentation. You guys did great.
Great, thank you.